All right, this week we're going to talk about types of knowledge and the connection with Bloom's taxonomy. So we kind of have to set the stage with types of knowledge. It is the main concept for this week, but Bloom's taxonomy is huge in learning theory, and so we'll cover that in depth, but on the second part of the week. I'm going to kind of segue into it, but then we'll go more in depth on the second day of the week into Bloom's taxonomy. So types of knowledge. You have declarative, conditional, conceptual, procedural. Most books or literature that you read, those are going to be the big picture items. There are more, but these are the ones that most students can relate to. So declarative would be if you're in a history class, factual information, that's declarative. So the reason types of knowledge are important for students to understand, based on the class that you're in, you've got to determine what to focus on. And so understanding what to go to first makes you more of an efficient learner. So if we want to tie this into last week, we talked about multiple intelligence theory, and that was really to make you an efficient learner at taking environmental information in. Well, if last week was about taking information from the environment and being efficient with it, this week is about being efficient and focusing on the types of knowledge important to that class. So this is really more about the class that you're in. So if you're in a history class, declarative information, that's what I would go to first if I were taking that class. So I'd want to know the facts, the dates. Then you have conditional information, like when to use certain information. And then you have conceptual knowledge. So conceptual knowledge would be linking concepts, and that's really what we've been doing all semester long, is taking these concepts and showing how they're all interconnected. Just like I just mentioned multiple intelligence theory and learning style and how that was taking information from the environment. And then I described how types of knowledge would be used based on the course. Right? That's all linking prior concepts and showing how they're interconnected. And then you have procedural knowledge, so process-oriented. So all the activities that we do in class, those are procedural. So if you're in a skill-based class, that's the first thing you want to focus on. If you're in a history class, the first thing you focus on is declarative. If you need to learn the big picture items first, you go to the conceptual knowledge. Like when I design a course, that's the first thing I look at. If it's something where you have to follow laws or rules, you go to the conditional information, like when to use this information. Just like the activities we have in class. When would you use that information? That's conditional. All of those that I just mentioned, if you're thinking about that, that's metacognition. That is a type of knowledge. It's thinking about what type of knowledge is important and what to focus on first based on the class that you're in. Now we can take all of those and break those up into two main concepts, explicit versus implicit. So let's talk about that in terms of those big four we just talked about. So explicit knowledge is more on the cognitive side of the house. And that will link to Bloom's taxonomy in just a second, because Bloom's is broken up into cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. So explicit knowledge would be like declarative. That would be a big picture item. So you see declarative, facts and events, great for history class, great for government. Then you have episodic. That would also be history, events, and experiences. Then you have semantic, facts and concepts. Again, history. So we're breaking these up. So that conceptual knowledge we just talked about, that's semantic, if you wanted to break it down into a more specific category. So conceptual knowledge would follow here, and then conditional knowledge, like laws and different rules. So traffic law would be a good example of conditional knowledge. Like you get to a four-way stop, who goes first? That's conditional knowledge. When to use that knowledge is important. Then let's go back up here to long-term memory. Explicit knowledge is a subcategory of long-term memory, but we also have the implicit side of the house. Now, I don't mention it here because I'm trying to simplify it, but procedural is not just skills and tasks, or implicit is not just procedural knowledge. It's also emotional knowledge, behavioral knowledge plays into that. And that's going to be the second half of the semester. But let's talk about implicit for just a second. The activities that we do in the class rely heavily on procedural memory, understanding how things go together in the order of operations. For this week, we're going to take some prior knowledge, some prior skills, and link it to this week's activity. So that is a form of conceptual knowledge, but the main focus is going to be procedural in nature. How do we use the thumb loop hand drill? If this is a primitive fire class where we're doing activities that are related to primitive fire, then we would be at the thumb loop hand drill at this point. And that's going to rely heavily on the process of doing the skill. So that's implicit. Now, when we get into motivation, those behavioral components, observational learning, and how motivation factors in, attribution theory, all of that's going to be on the implicit side of the house. So these two are interconnected, explicit and implicit. They go hand in hand, even though they are different, meaning that this tends to be on the cognitive side of the house, and this tends to be on the affective or psychomotor side of the house. And when I say psychomotor, I'm talking more about the skill-based side, and affective, I'm talking more about the behavioral component. They all relate. And your ability to take information and store it in long-term memory, you've got to know what to focus on. That's what the explicit side does. So does the procedural, like knowing when to focus on the process. But motivation plays a huge role in it. If you're not motivated to learn it, often you won't even put forth the effort. And that relates to attribution theory. So you can see how these two are related. Everything I just mentioned will make more sense once we get to the second half. But just think of long-term memory being broken down into explicit versus implicit. Now, before I move on, because I don't want to get into Bloom's taxonomy, but I do want you to see how the cognitive part of Bloom's is part of long-term memory before we start talking about the activity. What I want you to think about for this activity is break long-term memory up into explicit versus implicit. What do you think is more important for this thumb loop hand drill? Do you think it's the concepts that we learned in prior classes? Or do you think it's the actual process? If you had to put weight on it, do you think it's explicit or implicit? Do you think the process is more important for somebody that's new and novel to this activity? Or do you think understanding the concepts? Talk about that as you film your attempts at the thumb loop hand drill. When you go back and edit the video, what was more important? The implicit side, the procedural knowledge, or the explicit side with the declarative facts and the conceptual knowledge and the conditional knowledge, like when would you use that primitive fire? That's what I want you to talk about in your video. And you can talk about just one or both, the combination of the two, doesn't matter to me. But remember, your activity videos, it's more important that you cover the learning concept or theory than it is talking about the skill. I don't want you talking about how it was done. I just want you to videotape the process in your attempt and tell me how that attempt ties in to the theory. All right, next class period, we're going to get into Bloom's taxonomy. So most people know about Bloom's from the cognitive domain, but it's actually broken up into 3 different elements, and we'll talk more about how that ties in.